The first thing that hit the floor was a first-edition leather-bound volume, its spine snapping with the sickening crack of dry bone. It didn't just fall. It was swept off the mahogany shelf by the hand of a man who viewed history as an obstacle to progress. The book lay splayed on the brick floor, yellowed pages fluttering like the wings of a dying bird. Then a second one followed. Then a whole shelf of classic literature toppling one after another, the heavy thuds echoing in the narrow space. Black ink from an overturned well bled across the floor, staining the floorboards like a dark, indelible sin. A stack of rare manuscripts tipped sideways, their fragile parchment tearing under the weight of a man's cold fury. By the time Adrian Volkov turned his back to the wreckage, the warm, hushed interior of Marlowe's pages looked like a battlefield. And through all of it, Alina Marlowe said nothing. She knelt on the floor among the ruins, her hands shaking as she clutched a handful of torn paper. Beside her, a young boy with wide, terrified eyes that Adrian failed to recognize as his own, clung to her apron, weeping in a silence that matched her own. Alina didn't look up with anger or even with a plea for mercy. Her expression was something quieter, a weary resilience that unnerved Adrian far more than any threat from a rival syndicate would have. He pushed through the heavy wooden door without looking back. Adrian Volkov was a man of iron and shadow, a visionary who had spent a decade dismantling the old world to build his own empire of glass and steel. He didn't just acquire property, he erased legacies, replacing crumbling theaters and family-owned corners with towers that bore his name in cold marble. His associates called him brilliant. His enemies called him a monster. Neither description had ever cost him a night's sleep. Volkov Heights was to be his crowning achievement, a billion-dollar fortress of commerce and luxury in the heart of the city. The acquisition had been a surgical operation, years of planning and millions in persuasion. Every deed on the block had been surrendered. Every signature had been secured except for one. Marlowe's pages sat wedged between two soaring skyscrapers like a stubborn memory that refused to fade. A small, dusty bookstore with a hand-painted sign and windows that held the glow of a dying afternoon. Adrian had sent 3 directives before ever stepping foot in the shop: market value, then double, then a figure that would have allowed any sane person to disappear into a life of luxury. Each time, Alina Marlowe had sent the contract back unsigned. No lawyers, no counter-proposals. Just a simple note on a scrap of paper, stating that some things were not for sale because they were already promised to the future. Subscribe to this channel as I continue with this story. The skyline of the city was no longer a silhouette of history. It was becoming a graph of Adrian Volkov's ambition. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 64th floor office, the world below looked like a collection of blueprints waiting for his signature to become reality. Adrian stood with his hands deep in the pockets of his tailored charcoal trousers, his reflection caught in the glass. A man with a jawline as sharp as the steel beams he commanded and eyes that held the cold, gray clarity of a winter sea. To the people on the street, he was a shadow that moved through the upper echelons of power, a man who didn't just buy buildings but replaced entire neighborhoods as if he were erasing a mistake on a chalkboard. He watched the tiny, flickering lights of the city and thought of it as his masterpiece. For 10 years, Adrian had operated on a single, unwavering principle: everything has a price, and those who claim otherwise simply haven't been confronted with enough force. He had dismantled old theaters where generations of families had wept and laughed, replaced corner diners that had served the same patrons for 40 years, and swept away small restaurants that were the beating hearts of their communities. In their place rose towers of glass and marble, cold monuments to a new era where his company's name was the only one that mattered. His board of directors called him a visionary, a man who could see the future before it was built. The media called him relentless, a predator in a 3-piece suit who never blinked in the face of a billion-dollar gamble. But in the quiet, sterile corridors of his empire, nobody called him kind, and Adrian had never once lost sleep over the omission. Kindness was a currency he didn't trade in. It was too soft, too unpredictable, and ultimately, too expensive for a man reshaping a skyline. Volkov Heights was supposed to be the pinnacle of this journey, a billion-dollar mixed-use complex that would anchor the center of the city. It was a project that had consumed 4 years of intricate planning and 2 years of aggressive acquisition. He had moved through the block like a surgical strike, securing every deed and every signature with the mechanical efficiency of a man who viewed human resistance as a mere technicality. One by one, the owners had folded, taking the checks that promised them a comfortable exit from the paths of his bulldozers. Except for one. Adrian's gaze shifted to the satellite map glowing on the mahogany desk behind him. At the very center of his grand design, a small, stubborn rectangle of land remained uncolored. Marlowe's Pages. It was an architectural anomaly, a 2-story brick building that sat wedged between the soaring shadows of progress like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. It was a place of dust and paper, of hand-painted signs, and the lingering scent of old ink, a relic that belonged to a version of the city he was currently burying. He had sent 3 offer letters to Alina Marlowe, each one progressively more astronomical than the last. He had offered her market value, then double, then 4 times the worth of the aging structure, a sum that should have been enough to make any woman of her modest means run for the hills. But each time the response had been the same, a polite, hand-written note, devoid of legal jargon or counterdemands, simply stating that the shop was not available. Adrian didn't understand not available. In his world, that was merely an opening gambit for a higher price. But as the weeks turned into months, and the delays began to bleed millions from his investors' pockets, his patience finally evaporated. He was a man who lived by the clock of permits and the rhythm of contractors, and this woman was a glitch in his perfect machine. He turned away from the window, his polished shoes clicking with predatory precision against the marble floor. He didn't need his lawyers or his fixers anymore. In his experience, when a person resisted, it was because they hadn't yet been looked in the eye by the man who held their future in his hands. Adrian Volkov was 38 years old, and he had never met a wall he couldn't knock down. As he reached for his coat, he wasn't thinking about the books inside the shop or the history of the woman who owned it. He was thinking about the footprint of his tower and how he was going to step right through the heart of Marlowe's Pages to plant it. The city was changing, whether Alina Marlowe wanted it to or not, and Adrian was the force of nature driving that change. He stepped into the private elevator, the silence of the descent mirroring the cold resolve in his chest. He was going to end this transaction personally. He was going to show her that in the shadow of Volkov, even the oldest stories eventually come to an end. The morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy gray shadows of the surrounding skyscrapers, casting only a pale, filtered light onto the brick facade of Marlowe's Pages. Inside, the air tasted of vanilla and old paper, a sharp contrast to the metallic tang of the construction site just across the street. Alina Marlowe moved through the narrow aisles with a practiced grace, her fingers tracing the spines of well-loved novels as she straightened a display of poetry. She was a woman of natural beauty, though the lines of exhaustion around her expressive eyes spoke of a resilience forged in hardship. To her, these shelves weren't just inventory. They were a sanctuary she had built with her own 2 hands to protect the only world her son, Lucas, had ever known. Lucas sat at a small wooden table in the children's corner, his soft brown hair messy from sleep as he carefully colored a picture of a dragon. He wore a small sweater vest over his shirt, looking every bit the innocent protector of his mother's peace. Every few minutes, he would look up to ensure she was still there, his big emotional eyes searching for the steady anchor of her presence. Alina would catch his gaze and offer a soft, reassuring smile, hiding the weight of the legal documents tucked away in the drawer behind her counter. The bell above the door chimed, a bright sound that usually signaled a friend or a regular. Instead, a man in a crisp dark suit entered, holding a thick manila envelope like a weapon. He didn't look at the books. He looked at the walls as if calculating the easiest way to tear them down. He was one of Adrian Volkov's many messengers, a man who spoke in the cold language of market value and urban renewal. He laid the envelope on the mahogany counter, the heavy thud interrupting the quiet scratching of Lucas' crayons. "Mr. Volkov is a patient man, Ms. Marlowe," the messenger said, his voice as polished as his shoes. "But even his patience has its limits. This is the final offer, triple the market value of this property. It's a number that would allow you and the boy to live anywhere in the world in any level of comfort you desire." Alina didn't touch the envelope. She didn't need to. She knew the numbers Julian Cole, and now men like Adrian Volkov, used to try and buy a person's history. She looked past the messenger, through the window where the massive skeleton of Volkov Heights loomed over her shop like a predator waiting for its prey. To Adrian, this was a transaction, a necessary acquisition to complete his billion-dollar masterpiece. To her, it was the only thing standing between her son and a world that had already taken so much from them. "Appreciate the offer," Alina said, her voice quiet but possessing that unnerving calm that comes from having made peace with a decision long ago. "But as I told Mr. Volkov in my previous letters, this shop is not available." Messenger sighed, a sound of practiced frustration. "Ms. Marlowe, look around. The neighborhood is changing. Every other owner on this block has signed. You are wedged between two brick buildings that are scheduled for demolition next week. You're holding up a project that will redefine the city skyline. Is a pile of old paper really worth this much trouble?" Alina's gaze drifted to Lucas, who had stopped coloring and was now watching the man with a wary, protective look. She thought of the way the light came through the windows in long, warm angles, catching the dust motes above the shelves. She thought of the grandmother who had taught her that kindness and memory were the only things that truly survived the passage of time. "It's not just paper," Alina replied. "It's a promise. This isn't a transaction for me. It's the only thing I have left." Messenger left the envelope on the counter, a silent threat, and walked out without another word. Alina watched him go, then picked up the envelope. She didn't open it to see the life-changing sum inside. Instead, she took a small piece of stationery from beneath the register. With a steady hand, she wrote a single sentence, her handwriting elegant and firm. "This home is not for sale." She tucked the note into the envelope, sealed it, and set it aside for the courier. She knew this wouldn't be the end. Men like Adrian Volkov were relentless. They replaced neighborhoods and erased legacies because they had never once been told their anger had consequences. They lived in towers with their names on the lobby walls, convinced that everyone had a price. Alina walked over to the children's corner and knelt beside Lucas. He reached out, his small hand gripping her apron for comfort. "Is the man coming back, Mama?" he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "It doesn't matter if he does, Lucas," she said, smoothing his hair. "We're staying right here. This is our place." Outside, the shadow of the Volkov Empire grew longer as the sun moved, but inside the bookstore, the smell of green and sweet and alive things lingered. Alina knew she was an immovable object in the path of a man who considered himself a force of nature. She didn't have his billions or his towers, but she had a memory that went back generations, and a love that was more durable than steel. As the afternoon faded into twilight, she began to close the shop, moving with the methodical attention of someone who had already decided to move forward, regardless of the storm gathering on her doorstep. Adrian Volkov did not walk into Marlowe's pages. He invaded it. The bell above the door gave a frantic, shrill chime as he shoved it open, the sound cutting through the heavy silence of the afternoon. He stood in the doorway for a heartbeat, his tall, commanding presence casting a long, jagged shadow over the polished brick floor. The air inside was still and smelled of aged paper and cedar, a world that felt fundamentally incompatible with the cold, metallic efficiency of the empire he was building outside. He didn't look at the books. He looked at the woman behind the counter, his dark eyes narrowed with the focused intensity of a man who had finally run out of patience. Alina Marlowe didn't move. She stood behind the mahogany counter, her hands pressed flat against the wood, watching him with a stillness that was more provocative than any shout. Beside her, Lucas shrank back, his small hand gripping the fabric of her apron as he stared at the intimidating stranger in the charcoal suit. Adrian felt a flicker of something in his chest, a momentary hesitation as he looked at the boy's wide, gray eyes, but he crushed it instantly. He was here for a signature, not a sentiment. "Time for letters is over, Ms. Marlowe," Adrian said, his voice low and vibrating with a dangerous edge. He pulled the unsigned contract from his breast pocket and slapped it onto the counter. "You are holding up a billion-dollar project for the sake of a few dusty shelves. Sign it and you can buy any building in this city. Refuse and I will make sure you have nothing left to protect." Looked down at the paper, then back up at him. Her eyes were expressive and filled with a pain he chose to ignore, but they held no fear. "I have already given you my answer, Mr. Volkov. This shop is my son's heritage. It is the only place where he is safe from the world you've built. My grandmother gave 40 years to this legacy, and I will not be the one to sell it for a skyscraper." Something in Adrian snapped. It wasn't just the refusal. It was the quiet, moral certainty in her voice that made his own power feel suddenly, infuriatingly hollow. He thought about the investors waiting for his call, the crane standing idle, and the ticking clock of a legacy he was desperate to cement. His arm swept across the nearest display shelf without a conscious thought, a calculated act of violence by a man who had never been told his anger had consequences. The first things to hit the floor were a collection of first-edition classics. The spine snapped against the hardwood with the sound of dry bone, and the air filled with the scent of old dust and ruined parchment. He didn't stop. He moved like a storm through the narrow aisles, his hands tearing through the history she had curated so carefully. A row of glass vases on the counter toppled, shattering into 1,000 jagged diamonds that skittered across the floor. A bottle of ink was swept aside, spilling its dark, indelible contents across a stack of rare manuscripts like a spreading sin. Lucas let out a small, choked sob and buried his face in Alina's side. Adrian paused, breathing hard, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of a decimated bookshelf. He expected her to scream. He expected her to plead for him to stop, to finally break under the weight of his authority. But as the dust settled, the only sound was the heavy thud of his own heart. Alina hadn't moved from behind the counter. She stood there with both hands still pressed flat against the wood, watching the destruction of her life's work with an expression that wasn't anger. It wasn't even hurt. It was something quieter, a devastating kind of resignation that made Adrian feel like the smallest person in the room. Her silence was unnerving, a void that his rage couldn't fill. "Are you finished?" she asked quietly. Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes remained locked on his, bearing witness to a man who had forgotten how to build anything that didn't require breaking something else first. Adrian stared at her for a long moment, the adrenaline in his veins turning to cold lead. He looked at the boy who was trembling against her, and then at the wreckage at his feet, the torn pages, the broken glass, and the dark stain of ink spreading across the floor. For the first time in a decade, he found he had nothing left to say. He turned and pushed through the heavy wooden door, the bell giving one last, mocking chime as he stepped out into the cold air of the street. He was in his car and several blocks away before his hand stopped shaking on the steering wheel. The city skyline, usually his source of pride, now looked like a jagged, hostile landscape. He tried to focus on the next meeting, the next permit, the next acquisition, but the image of Alina Marlowe wouldn't leave him. It wasn't her defiance that haunted him. It was that quiet, steady gaze. She had looked at him not as a powerful man, but as a man who was profoundly lost. As he drove through the heart of the city he was reshaping, the silence of his luxury sedan felt suffocating. He had spent years replacing neighborhoods and erasing legacies, convinced that he was a visionary. But as he remembered the way she knelt among the ruined books, picking up the torn pages as if she still intended to open the doors tomorrow, he felt the first cracks in his own resolve. He had won the battle of the shop, yet as he pulled into the gates of his estate, Adrian Volkov felt like he had lost something he didn't even know he possessed. The storm inside him hadn't passed. It had simply changed direction, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to navigate the wreckage. The silence of the Volkov estate was usually a source of comfort for Adrian, a vacuum where he could process the complexities of his empire without the interference of the outside world. But tonight, the quiet was heavy, saturated with the image of the woman kneeling in the wreckage of her bookstore. He sat in his leather chair, the glow from his monitors casting a sharp, blue light against the angular planes of his face. He had always believed that every person had a seam, a hidden debt, a secret rival, or a quiet desperation, that if pulled would cause their entire resistance to unravel. Alina Marlowe had to have one. He leaned forward and pressed a button on his desk, summoning his head of security, a man named Victor who specialized in finding things people didn't want found. When Victor entered, Adrian didn't look up from the screen displaying the street-level view of Marlowe's pages. The small building looked even more fragile than it had that morning, a tiny brick island surrounded by the rising tide of his construction equipment. "I want everything on Alina Marlowe," Adrian said, his voice dropping into a register of cold command. "I don't want a standard background check. I want the history she's trying to bury. Look for liens, look for old family disputes, look for who she's protecting. Nobody refuses that much money for the sake of heritage, unless they're hiding something more valuable than the cash." Victor nodded and withdrew, leaving Adrian alone with his thoughts. He told himself this was just a tactical move, a way to move a stubborn obstacle out of his path so he could finish his masterpiece. But as he stared at the screen, he found himself thinking about the way she had looked at him, not with the terror he was used to, but with a quiet, observant pity. It was a gaze that suggested she knew something about him that he had forgotten about himself. He spent the next few hours attempting to lose himself in the logistics of Volkov Heights, reviewing permits and architectural renders, but his mind kept drifting back to the smell of the shop, the vanilla and old paper that seemed to linger in his coat. He remembered the boy, Lucas, and the way the child had clung to Alina as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. By midnight, a notification chimed on his private server. Victor had delivered the initial archive. Adrian opened the file, expecting to see a ledger of failures or a connection to a rival syndicate. Instead, the screen filled with records of a life lived with a terrifying lack of paper trails. There were no massive debts, no hidden partners. There was only a record of a woman who had worked 3 jobs to keep a failing bookstore afloat while raising a child in a city that didn't care for her survival. He scrolled through digital copies of tax returns and utility bills, searching for the crack in the foundation. He found records of Alina taking over the shop after her grandmother's passing, a transition marked by a refusal to sell the property even when the taxes nearly tripled. She had operated on a razor-thin margin for 7 years, her only luxury being the preservation of the space itself. Then his eyes caught on a series of medical records from a hospital several towns away, dated 7 years prior. They weren't for Alina. They were for a woman named Sarah, a name that made the air in Adrian's lungs go suddenly cold. Sarah had been a ghost from his past, a woman he had cared for in a different life before the Volkov name became a crown of thorns. He had believed she had disappeared by choice, moving far away to escape the shadow of his family's business. The records showed Sarah had arrived at the hospital in the final stages of a difficult pregnancy, her health failing rapidly. And beside her name, listed as the primary contact and eventual guardian of the infant, was Alina Marlowe. Adrian felt the floor shift beneath him, a sensation of vertigo that had nothing to do with the height of his office. He looked back at the photograph of Lucas in the file, the boy with the soft brown hair and the big, emotional eyes. For the first time, Adrian stopped looking at the child as an obstacle and started looking at the features he shared. The curve of the jaw, the specific, stormy gray of the eyes, they weren't just similar. They were a mirror. He realized then that his search for dirt had led him into a vault of his own secrets. Alina wasn't hiding a debt. She was hiding a boy from a man who had made the world too dangerous for him to exist in. She had stayed in that small, vulnerable shop, refusing his millions, not because of greed or pride, but because she had promised a dying woman that the boy would never be a Volkov. Adrian leaned back, the silence of the room now feeling like an accusation. He had spent the morning trashing the sanctuary of the woman who had spent 7 years protecting his only son from his own legacy. He had looked at his heir and saw only a nuisance to his construction schedule. The archive of secrets was open now, And as he stared at the digital records of Sarah's death and Alina's sacrifice, the billionaire visionary felt the first real weight of a debt that no amount of money could ever pay back. The digital file on Adrian's screen felt heavier than any architectural blueprint he had ever handled. It was a simple school registration form from a local elementary school, a document meant to be mundane, yet in the sterile silence of his office, it felt like an indictment. He scrolled past the address of the bookstore and the emergency contact information, listing Alina Marlowe as the sole guardian, until his eyes stopped at the section for parental information. The space for the father's name was not just empty, it was a stark white void, a deliberate erasure that spoke of a secret kept with terrifying discipline. Then he clicked on the attached student ID photo. The image that expanded across his high-resolution monitor forced the air from his lungs. It was a boy with a soft, hesitant smile, but it wasn't the smile that held Adrian captive. It was the eyes. They were wide and expressive, framed by the same thick, dark lashes that Adrian saw in his own reflection every morning. They held the specific, stormy gray of a restless sea, a trait that had been a hallmark of the Volkov lineage for 3 generations. The boy's hair, a messy tumble of brown, was pushed back from a forehead that matched Adrian's with haunting precision. Adrian leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking like a warning. He remembered the afternoon in the bookstore, the way he had looked at the child as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture in the way of a demolition crew. He remembered the boy's terror, the way Lucas had buried his face in Alina's apron to hide from the man who was currently tearing his world apart. Adrian had stood in that shop as a conqueror, never realizing that the small, trembling life he was frightening was the only part of himself worth saving. He thought back to Sarah, to the months they had spent together before the weight of his father's empire had pulled him back into the shadows. He had believed her when she said she wanted a life away from the violence, away from the cold marble towers and the men in charcoal suits. He had let her go, thinking he was being merciful by leaving her to her quiet anonymity. He had never imagined she was carrying the one thing that could truly link him to the future. The timeline in the file was surgical in its clarity. Sarah had died shortly after the birth, leaving the infant in the care of her closest friend, the quiet, stubborn woman who had spent the last 7 years building a fortress of books to keep the Volkov name from ever reaching the boy's ears. Alina Marlowe hadn't just been protecting a shop, she had been protecting a child from the very man who stood before her today. She had looked at Adrian's billions and seen only the blood and the shadows that would eventually swallow Luca's whole if he ever found out who his father was. Adrian stood and walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling city, the towers he had built, the neighborhoods he had erased, the masterpiece of Volkov Heights. It all felt suddenly like a pile of glass shards. He had prided himself on being a visionary, a man who could see years into the future, yet he had been blind to the life unfolding only a few blocks away. Every brick he had ordered moved, every threat he had leveled against the bookstore had been a strike against his own flesh and blood. He remembered the ink spreading across the bookstore floor, the sound of the books hitting the ground like falling bodies. He had destroyed her sanctuary. He had terrified his son. And he had done it all with the arrogant belief that he was the only one in the room who understood the value of a legacy. His phone buzzed on the desk, a message from his lead architect about the foundation pour for the North Tower. Adrian didn't pick it up. He couldn't stop staring at the boy's eyes on the screen. The stormy gray was an accusation. It told him that while he had been busy reshaping the city skyline, Alina Marlowe had been doing the much harder work of shaping a soul. He realized now why her silence had unnerved him so deeply. It wasn't just the silence of a victim. It was the silence of a guardian who knew a truth so powerful it made his billions look like pocket change. She had known exactly who he was the moment he walked through that door. She had watched him destroy her livelihood, her hands flat on the counter, and she had likely been praying that the monster in the suit wouldn't recognize the light in the boy's eyes. Adrian reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from the screen, tracing the outline of Lucas' jaw. The cold, calculating man who had never lost sleep over a demolition was gone, replaced by someone who felt the crushing weight of a debt that could never be settled with a check. He had spent his life building walls, but as he looked at the son he had nearly crushed under the weight of his own ambition, Adrian Volkov realized he was finally standing in the middle of a ruin he didn't know how to fix. The realization didn't come with a roar. It settled over Adrian like a cold, suffocating fog. He sat in the dim light of his study, the digital files still glowing on his desk, tracing the timeline of a life he had never lived. For 7 years, he had been a god of industry, his hands stained with the ink of billion-dollar contracts and the metaphorical blood of the rivals he had crushed to reach the summit. He had spent his nights in penthouse suites that tasted of expensive scotch and hollow victories, convinced that he was the architect of his own destiny. But as he scrolled through the receipts of Alina Marlowe's life, he saw the grueling reality of the world he had ignored. While he was deciding which city block to raise, Alina had been calculating how to stretch a gallon of milk and a heating bill. He saw records of late-night shifts at a local diner, the meager earnings funneled directly into a savings account for a boy who grew out of his shoes faster than she could replace them. He saw the repair bills for a leaking roof that she had likely patched herself, and the dental records for a child who had never known a father's name, only the steady, exhausted warmth of a woman who refused to let him feel the cold. Adrian felt a sickening hollow in his chest. He had built a kingdom of blood and steel, surrounded by men who feared him and women who wanted his shadow, yet his own son had been living in the quiet, desperate margins of the city he claimed to own. Lucas had been raised in a world of library books and hand-me-down sweaters, shielded from the violence of the Volkov name by a woman who had every reason to hate the man who bore it. He looked at his own hands, the skin smooth and untouched by manual labor, and thought of Alina's hands, the way they had been pressed flat against the counter, calloused and ink-stained, as he tore her life apart. She had worked 3 jobs so that Lucas could have a childhood defined by peace rather than power. She had chosen the grinding struggle of poverty over the gilded cage of the Volkov legacy, and she had done it with a dignity that made his entire empire look like a cheap imitation of success. The silence of those 7 years began to scream at him. Every moment he had spent expanding his influence, Lucas had been learning to read in a corner of that bookstore. Every time Adrian had ordered a hit or a hostile takeover, Lucas had been sleeping in a room that smelled of cedar and old paper, unaware that the monster the city whispered about was the man who had given him his eyes. Alina had stood as a sentinel between them, a lone woman with no weapon but her resolve, keeping the darkness of Adrian's world from extinguishing the light in the boy's soul. Adrian realized that his visionary plans for Volkov Heights were nothing more than a grave he was digging for his own heritage. He had been so obsessed with the height of his towers that he had never looked down to see the foundations of the people he was crushing. He had treated Alina like a nuisance, an obstacle to be moved for a better view, never understanding that she was the only person on earth who had saved his son from becoming a man like him. He thought of the way Lucas had looked at him in the shop, not with the awe people usually reserved for the great Adrian Volkov, but with the raw, visceral terror a child feels for a predator. That was his legacy. Not the glass towers, not the billions in offshore accounts, but the fear in the eyes of his own flesh and blood. The weight of the debt he owed Alina Marlowe was a mountain he didn't know how to climb. She had given Lucas 7 years of innocence, 7 years of believing the world was a place of stories and kindness, and Adrian had shattered that illusion in 10 minutes of unchecked rage. He had walked into her sanctuary and brought the very blood she had been hiding the boy from. As the first light of dawn began to touch the skyline, Adrian didn't feel the usual surge of pride at the sight of his towers. He felt a profound, aching sense of loss. He had built a world where he had everything, yet he was standing in the middle of a desert. The peace Alina had cultivated for Lucas was more valuable than any skyscraper he would ever build, and he had nearly leveled it for the sake of a parking garage. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy, and walked to the closet to find a coat that didn't feel like a suit of armor. He didn't want the charcoal wool or the silk lining today. He wanted to shed the skin of the billionaire and find the man who had once known Sarah, the man who might still have a shred of the humanity Alina had worked so hard to preserve in their son. He knew that an apology wouldn't be enough. You don't fix a broken soul with a check, but he had to go back. He had to face the ruins he had created and see if there was anything left in the rubble that money couldn't buy. The kingdom of blood was over. Now, he had to see if he was capable of building something that actually mattered. The morning air was cold and bitingly sharp as Adrian pulled his car to the curb, a block away from the construction site that bore his name. He didn't want the armored roar of the SUV to announce his arrival. He walked the remaining distance on foot, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a plain black overcoat, his eyes fixed on the small brick building that looked like a wounded animal huddled beneath the towering skeletons of the new city. The silence of the neighborhood at dawn was punctuated only by the rhythmic, hollow scrape of a broom against stone. When he reached the front of Marlowe's pages, he stopped. The glass from the front door, which he had slammed with such violence the day before, had been cleared from the sidewalk, but the interior was a graveyard of ambition. Through the window, he saw Alina. She was alone. She moved with a slow, mechanical precision, sweeping the shards of glass and the remains of ruined books into a neat pile in the center of the floor. She wore the same green dress as yesterday, but her beige apron was stained with ink and grime. She looked smaller than he remembered, her shoulders hunched under the weight of a fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. Adrian pushed the door open. The bell, usually so bright, gave a stunted, metallic click. Alina didn't look up immediately. The broom continued its steady rhythm. "The shop is closed, Mr. Volkov," she said, her voice raspy and thin. "There's nothing left for you to buy, and certainly nothing left for you to break." Adrian stepped into the wreckage, his polished shoes crunching on a fragment of ceramic he had missed the day before. He looked at the shelves he had decimated, the pages of poetry and history now just litter on a damp floor. "I didn't come to buy anything," he said, and for the first time in his professional life, his voice sounded foreign to his own ears, uncertain and stripped of its usual resonance. Alina finally stopped. She leaned on the broom, her knuckles white against the wooden handle. She looked at him, and the dark circles under her eyes were like bruises against her skin. "Then why are you here? To admire the view, to see how well the demolition is coming along." Adrian reached into his pocket and pulled out a check. It was a blank slate of his power, signed and ready to cover the cost of every book, every shelf, and every hour of labor required to make the room look as if he had never stepped foot inside it. He held it out to her, the paper trembling slightly in the cool air. I want to make this right," he started, the words feeling like jagged stones in his throat. "The damage, the books. I have a crew on standby. They can be here in an hour. They can restore everything. I'll pay for the finest materials, the rarest editions. You won't even remember this happened." Looked at the check, then back at his face. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she let out a short, hollow laugh that held more pain than a scream. "You really think this is how it works, don't you? You think you can just write a number on a piece of paper and erase the look on my son's face when he saw you?" The mention of Luca's hit Adrian like a physical blow. He felt the structure of his personality, the cold, calculating billionaire who could solve any crisis with a transaction, begin to crumble. He had prepared an apology, a sequence of logical points about the stress of the project and the necessity of progress, but looking at her, the entire edifice of his ego collapsed. "I didn't know," he whispered, the check still hanging in the air between them, a useless scrap of paper. "About Lucas, about Sarah, I didn't know he was mine." Ina's expression didn't soften, it hardened into something impenetrable. She set the broom aside and walked toward him until she was only a foot away. "That's the difference between us, Adrian. You only care about what you know, what you can see on a balance sheet or a background check. You didn't need to know he was your son to treat him like a human being. You didn't need to know who I was to respect the life I was building here." "I was wrong," he said, the admission tearing through him. "Alina, please. I can stop the demolition. I can fix the shop. "You can't fix the trust, Adrian," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that filled the entire ruined room. "You came in here like a storm because you thought I was small. You thought I was nothing. And you would have kept thinking that if you hadn't found a piece of yourself in my son's eyes. That's not an apology. That's just a change in your investment strategy." Adrian stood in the middle of the debris, the billionaire who had reshaped the city skyline, feeling utterly bankrupt. The check fell from his fingers, fluttering down to rest on a damp, ink-stained copy of a book he had destroyed. He wanted to tell her that he had spent the night staring at Lucas' photo, that he had felt the first real heartbeat of his life when he realized he had a son. He wanted to tell her he was a man who wanted to change. But as he looked at the wreckage around him, the physical manifestation of his own character, he realized that his words were just more glass shards. He had spent a lifetime building towers of pride, and now that they were falling, he had no idea how to stand in the rubble. "I just wanted to help," he said, his voice cracking. "Then go," Alina said, turning back to her pile of broken things. She picked up the broom again, the scrape, scrape, scrape resuming its lonely rhythm. "If you want to help, leave us with the one thing you've never given anyone. Leave us alone." Adrian turned and walked out of the shop, the bell mocking him one last time. He stood on the sidewalk as the first construction crews began to arrive at the site across the street, their heavy machinery groaning to life. For the first time, the sound didn't represent progress to him. It sounded like the end of the world. He looked at the shop, then at the towering heights above, and realized that for all his power, he was the only thing in this city that was truly broken. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of construction machinery usually sounded like progress to Adrian Volkov, but today, it sounded like a countdown to an execution. He sat in the back of his darkened sedan, parked just far enough from Marlowe's pages to be invisible, but close enough to see the first crane beginning to pivot toward the block. He had spent the last hour staring at a legal document, not a contract for a demolition, but a deed of trust that would transfer a staggering percentage of his personal wealth into an account for a boy who didn't even know his last name. He stepped out of the car, the cold wind whipping at his coat, and walked toward the shop. The front window had been boarded up with raw plywood, a jagged scar on the face of the building. Inside, the air was cold. Alina had not turned on the heat, perhaps because she couldn't afford to, or perhaps because she was already mourning the space. She was sitting at the small wooden table in the children's corner, the one where Lucas had been coloring the day before. The boy was nowhere to be seen, likely hidden away in the small apartment upstairs. Alina didn't look up when the bell clicked. She was staring at a stack of salvaged books, her fingers tracing a water-damaged cover. "I told you to leave us alone, Adrian," she said, her voice devoid of the sharp edge it had held that morning. Now it was just hollow. "I can't do that," Adrian said, stepping closer. He didn't loom over her this time. He sat in the tiny, mismatched chair opposite her, his knees high, looking absurdly out of place in his $1,000 suit. He placed a leather portfolio on the table. "I've spent my life thinking that power is something you build upward. Towers, empires, bank accounts. I thought if I gave you enough money, I was giving you the world." He pushed the portfolio toward her. "Inside is everything. A trust for Lucas that makes him one of the wealthiest children in this country. Ownership of this entire block transferred to you. My resignation from the board of the Heights project. It's a fortune that could buy you 1,000 bookstores in 1,000 different cities." Alina didn't even open it. She looked at the leather casing as if it were a strange, prehistoric relic. "And what does this fortune cost him?" she asked quietly. "It costs him nothing," Adrian insisted, his voice cracking with a desperation he didn't know he was capable of. "It's his birthright. I want him to have the best schools, the best doctors, the security that only a Volkov can provide. I want to be his father, Alina. I want to make up for the 7 years of silence." Alina finally looked at him, and the pity in her eyes was more devastating than any bullet. "You think security comes from your name? Adrian, your name is why Sarah ran. Your name is why I wake up every night and check the locks on the door. You think you're offering him a future, but you're just offering him a target." She stood up, walking to the window and looking out at the shadow of the rising tower. "You asked me what the price of this fortune is. The price is his peace." The moment he becomes a Volkov, he stops being a little boy who loves dragons and starts being a piece on someone's chessboard. He becomes a prize for your enemies and a tool for your friends. Adrian stood as well, his hands trembling. I can protect him. I have the resources. You couldn't even protect him from yourself, she interrupted, turning to face him. Her eyes were fierce now, the protective instinct of a woman who had fought in the trenches of poverty to keep a soul clean. You walked into this room and destroyed his world because you wanted a better view for a parking garage. That is the world you want to bring him into, a world where things are only valuable if they can be owned. She walked back to him and pushed the portfolio back across the table. I don't want your money, Adrian. I don't want your trust funds or your deeds. I spent 7 years raising a boy who is kind, who is gentle, and who looks at a book and sees a friend, not a transaction. I did that by keeping him away from men like you. I am his father, Adrian whispered, the words sounding like a plea. A father protects, Alina said. So if you want to be a father, do the only thing that will actually save him. Leave this place alone. Stop the demolition, move your tower, and never come back. Give him back the silence you broke. That is the only price I will accept for his life. Adrian looked at the portfolio, the sum of his life's work, lying rejected on a scarred wooden table. He looked at Alina, who was standing tall in a green dress and a stained apron, and realized she was the only person who had ever truly beaten him. She wasn't asking for a buyout. She was asking for his disappearance. She was asking him to choose between his ego and his son's safety. For a long minute, the only sound was the distant, muffled roar of the city. Adrian felt the weight of the Volkov name, the kingdom of blood he had built, and for the first time it felt like a shroud. He realized that to save Lucas, he had to remain a monster in the boy's memory, a shadow that had passed through and vanished, rather than a father who would eventually drag him into the dark. Is that all you want? Adrian asked, his voice barely audible. To never see me again. I want him to grow up without knowing what it's like to have a shadow like yours over his head, Alina replied. I want him to be free of you. That is the greatest gift you could ever give him. Adrian picked up the portfolio. He felt 1,000 years old. He looked toward the stairs leading up to the apartment, knowing Lucas was just a few feet away, yet miles out of reach. He turned toward the door, his hand on the handle. The demolition orders are being rescinded tonight, Adrian said, not looking back. The block is yours. I'll make sure no one from my world ever touches this street again. Thank you, Adrian, she said. It wasn't a reconciliation, it was a goodbye. He stepped out into the cold, the bell chiming a final, mournful note. As he walked toward his car, he signaled his lead architect on his phone. He didn't give an explanation. He just gave the order to pivot the entire billion-dollar project, to redesign the base, to leave a hole in the heart of his masterpiece. He was going to build his empire, but he was going to build it as a wall to keep the world away from Marlowe's pages. He had finally learned the price of being a father. It was the cost of never being known by the one person he loved. 6 months later, the center of the city had been transformed into a landscape of soaring glass and polished obsidian. Volkov Heights was no longer a blueprint. It was a titan of architecture, its summit piercing the low-hanging clouds like the prow of a great ship. It was exactly what the world expected from Adrian Volkov, grand, imposing, and flawless. Yet, as the morning sun hit the glass, the building did something no one had predicted. Instead of a sheer, brutalist wall of steel, the foundation of the North Tower curved with an almost organic grace, creating a wide, protective archway that looked like a stone embrace. At the heart of that curve, nestled into the luxury of the New World, sat the red brick facade of Marlowe's pages. The contrast was startling. The bookstore looked like a small, warm ember burning at the base of a cold mountain. The plywood was gone, replaced by thick, tempered glass that sparkled in the light. The window boxes were no longer seasonal afterthoughts, but were overflowing with deep green ivy and bright, resilient marigolds. Through the glass, the interior glowed with the amber light of low-hanging lamps, the shelves restocked and rising toward the ceiling like a cathedral of stories. It was a flourishing sanctuary, shielded on 3 sides by the billion-dollar walls Adrian had built specifically to ensure that the noise of the city and the shadow of his own world would never touch it again. Adrian stood on the opposite sidewalk, a ghost in a sea of commuters. He wore a simple coat, his collar turned up against the wind, his presence anonymous among the thousands who worked in the tower that bore his name. He didn't enter the shop. He hadn't stepped foot on that side of the street since the night he had rescinded the demolition orders. He watched from the distance he had promised Alina he would maintain. The bell chimed, a sound he could almost hear even through the rush of morning traffic, and the door swung open. Alina stepped out onto the sidewalk, her hands on her hips as she took a deep breath of the morning air. She looked different. The hollow exhaustion that had defined her face was gone, replaced by a steady, quiet strength. She looked up at the towering heights of the Volkov Empire and didn't flinch. She knew the walls weren't a threat anymore. They were a fortress. A moment later, a small figure darted out behind her. Lucas, wearing a bright yellow raincoat over his sweater, carried a small wooden sign to the edge of the sidewalk. He moved with the unburdened energy of a child who believed the world was a safe place. He set the sign down, "New Arrivals," tales of dragons and heroes, and looked up at the sky, his big, emotional eyes catching the light. Adrian watched his son from across the divide. He saw the boy laugh as a stray gust of wind caught his hair, and for a heartbeat, Lucas looked toward the crowd where Adrian stood. The boy didn't recognize him. To Lucas, Adrian was just another stranger in a city of millions, a face in the crowd that meant nothing at all. And while the realization felt like a slow-turning blade in Adrian's chest, it also brought a peace he had never known. He had given his son the greatest gift a man like him could offer, a life without a father's shadow. He remembered the final conversation with his own father, a man who had taught him that the only way to protect a legacy was to crush anything that threatened it. Adrian had believed that for 38 years, but as he looked at the bookstore, he realized that a true legacy wasn't built on what you dominated. It was built on what you were willing to sacrifice. He had lost his son's recognition, his presence at the dinner table, and the chance to hear his voice, but in exchange, he had given the boy a world where kindness was the only law. Inside the shop, a customer entered, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood long before the towers arrived. Alina greeted her with a warm smile, and Lucas ran to help her find a book. The cycle of the neighborhood continued, preserved in a bubble of brick and paper at the center of a glass world. As Adrian turned to walk away, heading back toward the office where he would spend his day managing an empire he no longer felt he truly owned, he caught sight of a small plaque he had ordered installed near the entrance of the tower's public plaza. It was modest, easily missed by the busy executives rushing to their meetings. It didn't mention the Volkov name or the cost of the project. It bore only a single line from a poem Alina had once mentioned. Some things are not for sale because they are already promised to the future. He knew he would spend the rest of his life as a guardian from the shadows. He would ensure the bookstore's taxes were paid through anonymous trusts, that the street remained safe, and that no rival ever looked twice at the block. He would be the monster at the gate, keeping the other monsters away, all so that the boy with the gray eyes could keep believing in dragons. The skyscraper loomed overhead, a masterpiece of engineering and wealth, but to Adrian, it was finally just a building. The real masterpiece was the small, stubborn bookstore at its feet, the place where his son was growing up to be a better man than he had ever been. As Adrian disappeared into the crowd, the sun finally cleared the top of the tower, bathing the small brick building in a brilliant, golden light. Flowers always bloom again, and in the heart of the city he had tried to break, a new story was beginning, written in a silence that was finally, truly peaceful.